Years ago, when Tammy and I were attending CCY, there was a lady that we knew. Her name was Roxanne. Roxanne was just an amazing woman. When we had met her, she was playing piano and pretty much leading the worship team. She did all of that. But over time, as we were there, Roxanne kind of went from being there all the time and taking charge of everything to where she moved a little bit slower, got to where she needed to have a cane, eventually needed help getting up and down the stage, got to the point that she couldn't play all of the time. Eventually she was homebound and spent the last 7 years of her life bedridden in a nursing home. Roxanne had lupus. Roxanne was one of those amazing ladies. She was an amazing woman of faith. She was an amazing friend as well. I have to be honest, that was during part of that time is when I was serving as a shepherd slash elder at CCY. And there were a number of times that myself and some of the leadership, we went over to Roxanne's house and we anointed her with oil and we prayed for healing. We prayed for a miracle. Roxanne never got better physically. But like I said, she was such an amazing woman of faith. She asked why. Sometimes she probably wondered why her. But at the same time, she never lost her faith. In fact, she was one of them that no matter what she was going through during that time in the home, she was always one to point you to Jesus. In fact, I know of one and possibly more people that were in the nursing home that she was at that she led to Christ. Clay told me he used to go once, if not every other week, and he said, if you ever want to see something amazing, you need to go with me one of these days when I take my guitar and listen to Roxanne sing. I can only imagine. But I have to admit that there were times in all of that, and even to this one, when I asked the question, why? Why does that have to happen? Why do people go through that? And I think that if we were going to be honest, we'd all have to admit that we've done that as well. Those times when we look around and we wonder what in the world is going on. Times when you say, why doesn't he do anything? Where is he? Where is God? Why does this happen? Why do bad things happen to good people? And we ask it in a lot of different places. We ask it when somebody that we love, is going through some ordeal, whether it's an abusive relationship they can't get out of, or a crippling disease, or any of that. We watch it and we wonder, why are they suffering? Maybe somebody we know, or maybe it's not somebody we know. We sit and we watch the news, and the news tells us about the statistics on human trafficking and the number of children that are sold into the sex trade. We see, pictures of refugees being herded into tent cities. We see the results of bombings and chemical weapons. We watch, I don't know how many of you, when you sat and you watched the aftermath of the Murrah building or 9/11, that you said, how in the world can God let this happen? Why doesn't he do something? Why didn't he stop this? Maybe it's where you are now. You're stuck in the middle of something and you're like, why is this happening to me? Maybe you know a friend they friend or a friend of a friend that had a loved one that went overseas to serve, never came back, or maybe came back missing a limb. Maybe you are friends on Facebook with somebody whose 9-year-old daughter has terminal cancer. I don't know. We all see those things, and there are times when we want to just shake our fist at God and scream up and say, why are you allowing this to happen to me? Why are you allowing this to happen to them? Why are you allowing this to happen to us? Have you been there? I think we all have. And so today, we're dealing with the question of why suffering. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why does suffering exist? Why does God allow it? I'm going to give you the easy answer, the low-hanging fruit, so to speak. It is because we live in a fallen world. That's why suffering exists, because we live in a fallen world, because sin entered into the world, and when sin entered into the world, it dragged in decay and death and disease and poverty and abuse and abandonment and everything else. And while that is the easy answer, and that, like I said, the low-hanging fruit, man, that's easy to, let's be honest, when we start to ask the question of why does God allow suffering, that's really not the question that we're asking. What we really want to know is, why is it happening to me? Why is it happening to them? Though I do want to kind of cut through a little bit of the noise for a second, because Galatians 5 says this, because a lot of people still want to, and I see it, and probably you do as well. Even though we understand that suffering is the result of sin, don't we still want to blame God? Do you still find yourself, I know I find a lot of people, we still want to blame God for bringing that and for making it happen. But here's the deal. Galatians 5 tells us this. It says that the acts of the sinful nature are obvious. Sexual immorality, impurity, debauchery, idolatry, and witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy, drunkenness, orgies, and the like. The causes that we see for the suffering on our planet are the result of the sinful nature. I mean, that's exactly what you can go back and you can look at any of the things that we listed, or any of the things that you are talking about or feeling or that you are watching, and they are results. They are the fruit of the acts of the sinful nature. I mean, we spend a whole lot of time going, well, this leads to this, which leads to this, which leads to this. But the problems in our world, the suffering that we see, whether it's on the other side of the planet, whether it is across the street, whether it's in our... That's it. It all goes back to that. It all goes back to the acts of the sinful nature, and but I know that's really not the question that we want answered. It's nice to know where it came from. What we really want to know is why it is that God allows it, why it is that people that we love are going through it, why we are going through it. But I think that sometimes, and here's one of the things, we find ourselves so many times we are right in the middle of everything. What's the old saying, you can't see the forest for the trees? Sometimes the best thing that we can do is remove ourselves from the picture in order that we can see our place in the picture. Okay? Sometimes we need to remove ourselves from the picture so that we can see our place in the picture. And here's what I mean. Read the Bible. Do you find suffering there? Do you? Well, we do, yeah. I mean, we find death, we find disease, we find abandonment, we find abuse, we find all kinds of persecution, death, everything. We find it there in the Bible. Okay, I was thinking about this. The Israelites were oppressed and enslaved for hundreds of years. before they were set free. Lazarus died, and his sisters mourned. David ran for his life, scared. Joseph was sold by his brothers into slavery. He was then falsely accused of rape and then imprisoned for something that he did not do. Stephen was stoned. Peter and John were thrown in prison. Paul had a thorn in his flesh. He was beaten. He was flogged. He was stoned. He was left for dead. He was in prison. Suffering is nothing new. I mean, the Bible is full of lepers and paraplegics and people that were born blind and women that suffered with bleeding for 12 years, and we have got war, and we have oppression, and we have enslavement. All of that, suffering is nothing new to us. But I think this is where I say that we've got to take ourselves out of the picture in order to see our place in the picture. Because one of the things, no matter what you look at the Bible, what's one of the things that you always find that never, ever changes? God. That God is God. And I know we say this, there's a tsunami somewhere, we have a personal crisis, we have an act of terrorism, and what's the phrase that we hear so many times? I've said it as well. We say God is still on his throne, that he is not shaken, he is not caught unaware. And I want to tell you that's not just big talk, that is truth. The fact is that God is God, and he is not shaken from his throne. And this is where we've got to remove ourselves from the picture sometimes, because if we look at the suffering that we see in the Bible, what's the result of it? The Israelites were oppressed for hundreds of years. They were enslaved for hundreds of years. What happened? God was shown, God was glorified, and the nation of Israel was born. Stephen was stoned for claiming what he said was truth. He was stoned for his beliefs. But what happened? That began the persecution which spread the church to the very far ends of the earth. Okay? We see all the way through. One of my favorite stories that I love, John chapter 9, the man born blind. I love Jesus. He says these words, and they're like, well, why did this happen? Why is this man suffering? There's the question. Why is he suffering? Is it because his parents sinned, or is it because he sinned? Why is he suffering? And God says, no. Jesus says, none of it. This has happened to him so that the work of God may be displayed in his life. What we find time and time again, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown into a blazing furnace. Yet when it's all over, what happens? King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, says, holy cow, there is no God who can save like the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The man who was born blind, he believes, he receives his sight, and he believes in Jesus. Time and time again, all throughout this, we got Paul, everything that happened to him. What ends up happening? Paul goes around and he's planting churches all over the Mediterranean. In fact, the majority of the New Testament that you and I read today was written by him. Much of it in prison. Much of it is the response of floggings and beatings and imprisonment that we find in his life. So time and time again, we see suffering. But what always happens out of it? God is glorified. God gets the glory. I think that sometimes we celebrated just a moment ago the greatest act of suffering ever. When Jesus willingly gave his life in exchange for yours. When he carried your sins and my sins to the cross and paid a debt that we couldn't pay. I don't know how many of you are on Facebook or if you saw it. This morning I get up and you always I try to write a little thing and I put it on Facebook when I get here, and sometimes it has to do with my message and sometimes it doesn't. And I have to admit, I come in this morning and kind of starting to go through and read my message, and I'm going through and I get on there and I'm gonna write something up, and the top post on my feed, it is a picture of Jim Caviezel as Jesus when they were doing all the beating. He's got the crown of thorns, bloodied and beaten. He's sitting there talking to Mel Gibson. You know, it's just a meme, and the meme says, "Yeah, what it looks like when I tell Jesus how horrible my life is." And I was like, "Yeah, I got no clue." He is the suffering servant. It was the greatest act of suffering that was endured by him that has provided the greatest gift to all of mankind, which is the promise of salvation and the forgiveness of our sins. Okay? Yeah, quit turning red, Caleb. I'm sorry. Just while we're talking about it, I guess, then how many women in here have given birth? Was it painful? No. Did you say you suffered? Yeah. Did you say things about your husbands? Yet it produces life, and it's produced some of the greatest gifts in your life. Okay? I think a lot of times when we start talking about suffering, I say that we've got to remove ourselves from the situation in order to see ourselves in the situation, is that we need to be reminded that suffering is, in many ways, suffering is the darkness that makes the light of Jesus shine that much brighter. It makes it so much more visible. And I think, but suffering also, it has another purpose that it fulfills, and we may not like it, but suffering reminds us that this world is not our home, that this is not what we were made for. Suffering reminds us that this can't be it. To me, I think a lot, suffering is to humanity what pain is to our bodies. It is a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign. It is telling us that something is wrong and it needs to be attended to. And I think suffering in so many ways, it's a reminder to us that this is not right. That we live in a world that is broken. When we see human beings mistreat other human beings, what's the thing we say? That's not right. That's our first response. When we see, whether it's wars or genocide or terrorism, we are reminded of what? We are reminded of the fact that evil is alive and it is active. We are reminded of the fact that this is not our home, that we do live in a broken world, that we live in a fallen world. And so it's a reminder to us when we see it that something's not right. But has anybody ever listened to Matthew West? I love Matthew West, and he's got a song called "Do Something." And I listen to it. It always catches me, like if I'm going walking, and it gets me. Because he says, I looked out and I saw poverty and slavery, and he's saying this stuff, and he says, and I shook my fist at heaven, and I said, God, why don't you do something? And he says, I did. I created you. I think we need to change our thinking. My dad, many, many years ago, I don't remember how many years ago, quit having problems. Doesn't mean he quit having issues, he just quit having problems. He quit having obstacles. Instead, what he had were opportunities and challenges. Change these words. Just change. No, you're like, oh yeah, that's great. The thing is that when you change the word, which you do so many times, as well as you change the attitude, and that was the next step of it, is instead of seeing things as a problem that he could not overcome, he saw it as a challenge to provide a solution. Instead of seeing it as an obstacle that got in his way, he simply saw it as a challenge to be able to find a way around, over, under, through, whatever it took. That it just changed his attitude. And I say that because a lot of times we need to remember that as Christians, we are told not to see things as the world sees things. We're told to look at them from a different perspective. I was going through here. Think about it this way. James chapter 1 says, James chapter 1 verses 2 and 3 says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance." In 2 Corinthians 12, Jesus is talking to Paul when Paul has said, "Take this thorn from my flesh." And what does Jesus tell Paul? He goes, "No." You know why? "Because my grace is sufficient for you, and my power is made perfect in weakness." We read in the scripture, we're told in 2 Corinthians 4, that our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal victory that far outweighs them all. Romans 5 verse 3 says that we should rejoice in our sufferings. Why? Because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance, character, and character, hope, and hope does not disappoint. We are told in the scriptures that all of these things, whether we're talking about powers or death or good or bad or anything else, that nothing can separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus. Right? We are told of all of these things that we see as suffering, that we see as obstacles, that we see as troubles and everything else. And he says, no. In all of these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. In all of these things, we are more than conquerors if we will turn around and begin to see them that way. And so I'm not trying to dismiss suffering. I'm not at all. But I think it would go a long ways if we would change our perspective, if we would change our attitude towards it. Because I think that in many ways, plain and simple, this is in the back of your bulletin, on the back page of the sermon notes, suffering provides opportunities. And I would tell you, put this up and you can stick it in up there where you see it every day or read it. But suffering provides opportunities for God's people to do God's work, to preach, to proclaim his goodness, and to exhibit his faithfulness. Now you're like, that's a neat little tagline. You know, in the scriptures, are we told as Christians that we are to care for orphans and widows? Yes. Okay, why? Because it makes a great bumper sticker? No, because God's saying they got nowhere else to go. They have nowhere else to turn. So, as God's people, we are called to do God's work so that we may proclaim and preach his goodness and exhibit his faithfulness. You know, you start talking about adoption. When you get into adoption and foster parenting, did you know that the number of families, the number of Christian families that have adopted or are fostering is double the number of families in any other group? Why? Because Christians have said, you know what? Here is a problem. Here is suffering. Here is an issue, and this is an opportunity. And maybe they never said it that way, but here's an opportunity for me as God's people to do God's work, to proclaim his goodness, to exhibit his faithfulness. And that's why we get involved. That's why we do these things. I mean, there are ministries that are all over the world, and they are the direct result of men and women of God who have said, you know what, enough is enough. I got to do something. I see this, and I've got to do something. I feel this, and I've got to do something. You know, there's the old saying is that necessity is the mother of invention. We've all heard that, haven't we? Okay. What's that mean? It means most of the time, the greatest inventions that we have, 9 times out of 10, they were the result of what? Of a need, of an issue, of a challenge, of an opportunity, a problem, an obstacle, whatever you want to call it. That's what they were the result of. And so not all of them, but many of them were. Something needed to be done. And so many of our greatest The greatest inventions of mankind have been the result of an issue, of a problem, because somebody decided something needed to be done about it. And so they came up with a way to do it. The other thing is, and this is where we got to change because okay, who thinks we should eliminate suffering? Okay, what suffering? Where do we draw the line? We got to pick the place. Because if we're going to eliminate something, and I think that's the question so many times, and like I said, this is not in any way a desire to downplay it or anything else, but we start, and it sounds great, and believe me, and in my heart I want to as well, but the fact is, where do we stop? What do we do? We're going to eliminate suffering. How much suffering is too much suffering? So where are we going to draw the line? Where are we going to say, whoop, no, that's enough, that's too much? Or are we going to draw the line with who? That they can, but we shouldn't. Where do we draw that line when it comes to it? Because, like I said, what we do know is suffering is the result of what? Suffering is the result. It is the fruit of the acts of the sinful nature. So if we're going to try, because we would love to say that we want to end all suffering, and I know if we're talking about chemical warfare, genocide, or violence, then we'd all be like, you know what, that's where suffering needs to end. But like I said, at what point where do you draw that line? Where do you say this is enough? Because if you're going to get rid of suffering, do you not need to get rid of all the things that bring about that suffering? And like I said, if we're talking about genocide and chemical warfare and all, yeah, absolutely. But what we find is that when we see countries, nations warring, it may be over borders, it may be over ideals, it may be over wealth. What do we find is that the acts of the sinful nature are obvious: greed, envy, and jealousy. At what point do we stop it? Okay? Obesity and heart disease are suffering. Don't take my bacon and eggs, though. I'm serious, and I know you're well, silly, you're overly dramatic. No, what I'm saying though is that if we have this great goal. We want to eliminate suffering. Well, there's a difference between eliminating and addressing. Because eliminating, if you're going to try to get rid of all of it, that you're going to have to get rid of all of the things that might bring in suffering. How about your house? Your house could be the reason for suffering because somebody else suffers from envy and jealousy of it, which means that they go out and they're going to rob, steal, whatever it is to accumulate the stuff to be able to have something like you, which causes pain and misery to somebody else. And it's not trying to make it light, it's just that it sounds so great to say these things sometimes. But the fact is that suffering exists because you and I have free will. Suffering exists because we, and every human being that has ever existed, had the option to choose to follow God's will or to follow our own will. We had the option to choose whether or not we want to live and have the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and respect, self-control, respect as well, in our lives, or do we want to live according to the acts of the sinful nature? That's free will. That is our choice. And so to sit and say that we are going to eliminate all suffering means that we are going to eliminate all opportunity of free will. There is a place where there will be no more pain, where there will be no more suffering. Where will it be? It will be in heaven. It will be in the presence of God. But let's be absolutely honest. Not everybody alive on this big blue planet right now wants to spend eternity there. Do they? They want their own form of it. They want to do it their own way, whatever. And there will continue to be, as long as we have free will, until Jesus returns, there will be. Jesus himself said the poor will always be with you. In this world you will have trouble. Right? But this is where we have to change our attitude. And this is why I'm saying take ourselves out of the picture so that we can see our place in the picture. We as Christians are called to do something about it. We are called as God's people to do God's work. And when we think about this for a second, if we got rid of all suffering, what would we do on Sunday mornings? Any clue? Maybe we wouldn't have to support any missionaries. We wouldn't have to give any money to help incorporate, so we could have a really, 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 really big building, and it would be plush and wonderful, and I mean, it'd be awesome. And then we'd get around and we would sing songs about how we love Jesus and Jesus loves us. But 99% of the hymnal and all the songs that we sing that are on the radio would need to be gotten away from. Because, I mean, there's no need for faith. There's no need for God as our refuge. There's no need for resting in His wings. There's no reason to say it is well with my soul because, hey, everything's good. Right? I mean, we can get rid of all of that stuff. And I said, that's where you talk about then, well, but we'd still need to have faith. Why? Everything's perfect. Well, we'd still need to have strength. No. I want you to think for a second about something. With that quote in mind, and I know not everybody's a Christian that does this, but what are some of the most amazing testimonies that you've ever seen? There are men and women who have gone through what they would call hell, whatever it was, and they've turned around and they have gotten up and they have dusted themselves off and they have gotten back into the fight and they have done amazing things. And we sit here today and we go, man, that charity was started by so-and-so. That ministry was started by so-and-so. I mean, we came back here and we bagged, we put together meals, right? You know why we did that? Because there's starving people on the other side of the world that needed it. Okay? It was an opportunity for God's people to do God's work, to proclaim His goodness and to exhibit His faithfulness. That's what serving is. That's what service is. And that's what we are called to do. Why is there suffering? Because there is sin in the world. Why is there suffering? Because we have free will. And I know that maybe you're sitting and you're like, yeah, that really doesn't help with what I'm going through right now. And I'm sorry. But and Jeremy said it so well. If you hurt, where do you go? You go to the doctor. If your soul hurts, if your heart aches, if you're suffering, where should you go? To the great physician. You know, some of the songs that are the most comforting to us are songs that were written by men and women who have gone through some of the worst stuff. And they went through it, and they relied upon God, and they found comfort and peace, and they wrote a song about it, or maybe that song was them pouring their heart out. The Psalms are full of them. And we read them today, and we are comforted. Why are we comforted? Because it draws us to the same place of peace and comfort that they found that peace and comfort. So many of the songs that we sing, so many of the passages that we read are reminders of the fact that yes, there will be suffering, but the answer to it and the place to go in the midst of it is not to ourselves, it is to Him. That He's going to give us what we need to get through it. That He's going to provide the grace and the mercy and the strength to get past whatever it is that we are going through. That our light and momentary troubles are providing for us an eternal glory that this won't even compare to what they are providing. And I know that when you're in a bad spot and you're struggling, that doesn't always provide the answer that you want. And my hope is that in that time, God is going to send somebody, one of His people, to come alongside you and to proclaim His goodness, to exhibit His faithfulness. if you got that friend, you got that person you know, you got that thing that you see on TV and it just makes your blood boil, it makes your heart break. Do something. If we want to see suffering lessened, then we need to do something about it. If we want to be the hands and feet of Christ, we're going to have to, one, we got to get out of the building. But two, that is to go to people where they are. In the midst of their suffering, in the midst of their depression, in the midst of their trials, in the midst of their frustrations, in the midst of whether it's physical, emotional, or spiritual, just junk, is to go to them and to come alongside them and to love them and to encourage them. I mean, we need to change the way that we see it. Because what do we do most of the time when it comes to suffering? We moan and lament how bad it is, that it'll never get any better. Why do anything? The thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. That's the devil whispering in our ears. It'll never get any better. It's always going to be this way. Nothing you can do. And we talked about that as far as being involved. What I'm saying is that we need to change the way that we see suffering. We need to be reminded of the fact that Jesus said, yes, in this world you will have troubles, but I have overcome the world. We need to be reminded that if we are here today and we are suffering, if we don't see light at the end of the tunnel, if we can't figure out what we're going to do, we're at that low place. There's one place to turn. Him. And Him alone. That is the only place to go to. And at the same time, we need to be reminded of the fact that when we look out and we see others that are struggling, when we see those that are going through difficult times, we need to do something about it. Find a way. It may be praying for them. It may be sending money. I don't know. But you would be amazed at the number of people. In fact, I was talking about Roxanne. We have another very dear friend in Yukon. And I was talking to Clay about this the other day, and we met Jonica, an amazing woman, had an amazing voice. She and Roxanne were really good friends. She was one of Roxanne's students. They became very good friends. She watched Roxanne go through this as lupus just slowly but surely just took over her body. Jonica was misdiagnosed, and they went in and performed a major surgery, and they were wrong. Not only did it not solve the problem, but it has made everything worse. But Jonica is one of them that I look at today, and her ability to stand in the midst of intense suffering. And I know what she would tell you if you asked her where she learned that. She'd say she learned it from rocks. So here's a woman who went through suffering, but taught it to somebody else. And I honestly believe with all of my heart that one day there's going to be somebody else that is going to be going through something, and they're going to say, you know what, there was this lady that I knew when we lived over here, and she was an amazing woman of faith, and I'm finding my faith in the same place, and I'm finding my peace and my relief in the same place. You don't know what God has in store for you and for others. You don't know how He is going to work. Mandisa sings the song Unfinished. We're all unfinished. He has begun a work in us, and whether we are not yet in suffering, whether we're going through it, whether we're on the other side of it, the fact is that He is still working in us so that we can, as God's people do God's work, proclaim His goodness, exhibit His faithfulness, and take the gospel and take the message of God's word.